All right. Hello, everybody. And thank you for joining us this evening for another great talk. Um, oh, I got some echo. Okay. So my name is David, and I'm joined here today by my co-hosts Iris and Tobias from Odessa, Germany, our guest speaker for the night.
Hello.
Usually I would give a little intro on who and what Adesso is, but since our last event, Adesso Netherlands has joined forces with 3 Dutch companies, namely Blue4IT, Code Squad, and Bluefront. So on this occasion, I instead would like to give the opportunity to my wonderful co-host, Iris, to introduce herself and tell you all a little bit more about Bluefront before we get going. Iris?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. So I'm here from the Bluefront company. We are a small consultancy company doing lots of things with JavaScript. We are a little club with about 15 people. We are always looking for very enthusiastic colleagues to join us. So if you feel like after this talk you want to join a vibrant club with lots of nice people, please contact us. This is the information that we have going. But of course, we are here more to hear about this wonderful talk of Tobias about Cypress. And I'm also very looking forward to it. I also work with Cypress on my own projects. So I'm very happy to let Tobias take the floor.
All right. It's great stuff, Iris. We are indeed now at our main event. And Tobias will tell us a bit more about Cypress. He's an amazing all-around developer and a person with an impressive track record and a true passion for what he does. Who's on top of all that also quite active in the community. Among other things, he's running, for example, the German Cypress meetup community. So make sure to click on over there and join them as well. One more thing for the questions and polls, there's the link to Slido-CypressNL, where you can add questions, and then at the end we'll go through them together. One more thing, we've also arranged a group chat at the end. We'll share details at the end of the talk, so you'll be able to hang out with us and Tobias and ask him questions yourself, but for that, you'll need to stick around. All right, and with that, I think it's time for me to stop talking, and I'll pass it on to you, Tobias. Take it away.
Thank you for the nice introduction and for having me here. I'm very happy that I can show off Cypress a little bit. Today I will give a small introduction into Cypress and also a little concept I had in mind and that is finally even realized. And yeah, but let's start our journey to Cypress. This talk is really for people, or mainly for people who don't know Cypress yet. And I will give an overview. And for the people who are already firm with Cypress, at the end you will get some additional information about that automated user documentation, or sometimes I call it documentation testing, but we come to that later. So for now, I prepared a little poll, and maybe you take your phone and snap the QR code here, or you enter the URL you see on the screen. While you all go there, I just give you a small hint or warning, like a prescription with a medical package. And it's, please consult the doctor, your leader or project manager about the talk attendance. Afterwards, the usage of Cypress might lead to test addiction and bold expression of happiness, especially in projects without a solid test suite. And I hope some of you already joined, because I have prepared some polls that I want to have in advance. And you should see now the first question on your phones or in your browser. So I would ask you to please answer the questions. I'll wait a little moment. I promise it's not too many questions, but I see there are already some people doing some end-to-end testing. Some haven't heard of all of this. Are they making jokes? Okay, I think this is answered so far. I have another question prepared. Are you using Cypress? Whoa. Quite some already do. Then I hope I will not bore you today. Okay, then I go over to the next one. About your testing experience, when it was not Cypress, of course. Or end-to-end testing experience. People who use Cypress mostly don't have to answer this. They can. Okay, so not so happy, the people in general, I would say. Okay, thank you for that. It's just two more I want to ask you. What hinders you to doing end-to-end tests more or starting at all? If you have different other reasons, you can later put it to the questions or to the comments, and so that I can understand more. So it seems like instability is one of the biggest problems, and the other systems. And too much effort to write them, and hard debugging. Okay. I'm about to close this poll now too. And this is the final one. I just want you to give me some hints what you like to know more about. I cannot promise that I will be able to address it today, but maybe at some points I can say a little bit more, or we do it later in our come together session or in the Q&A session. Just enter some words, and hopefully a word cloud here appears. And if I cannot answer it today, maybe I can organize someone who talks about that topic next time, or maybe I can talk about it. And if I know what are your pain points, everyone is having their own words. Okay. End-to-end in general, we can talk a little bit about today. Okay. Thank you for doing that with me. By the way, you can still stay on that page, and you should see a Q&A field. So if you have questions during the talk, just enter it there. and later we will use that to get through the open questions. Okay, so a little bit about me. Again, I mean, I had a nice introduction, but I'm working as a principal JavaScript engineer at Adesso SE, and I'm now for about 20 years in web development. I did back-end, front-end, whatever, like that full stack, what people sometimes say. And I co-organize the NG Niederrhein. It's an Angular meetup. Co-organizer, it's a JS Unconf in Hamburg. It's a conference where the people bring their talks with them, or people ask for talks, and it's happening like a bar camp with votings and so on. And then the conference starts. So we never know in front who will talk and about what. And because of Corona, of course, at the moment it's not happening. But when it's happening again, maybe come by. It's also not only German. There are many English talks as well, so it might be relevant for you as well. Yeah, I'm tweeting. My name there is @topmaster, and I'm framework agnostic, so I don't care about any frameworks or technologies in general. I think with every technology you can build great stuff, and I don't like that that fights about technologies, they don't lead to anything. And since this year, I'm also Cypress ambassador. That is just that I have a good connection to the Cypress team, and that I can try out their software and stuff like that. Because I love Cypress, and I love to talk about it, and I spread it, and so I got that title. Okay, talking a little bit about testing now. Maybe some of you already know a testing pyramid, or in probably any kind of business meeting or so, you'll see sooner or later one pyramid. And in this case, it is about the end-to-end tests, integration tests, and unit tests. And because some of you didn't exactly knew what is what, we will talk about the different types of testing now. So unit tests, they are usually isolated by mocks and stuffs. So I don't test any other things in my systems, just that one unit. A unit can be defined in different ways. A unit is, in many cases, a component I have in my front end, for example. And everything else, services it needs or other dependencies, I will mock away. So the combinations with those other services and components are not tested. It is great if you want to test for libraries or core components, and having that to test business logic and not layout. It is usually covering often forgotten use cases. For example, if you have an integration test where you don't test some use cases, and with a unit test you test for specific functionality of that component. So it's good for that. And usually you test it in the browser or with an emulated DOM. So these tests, especially when you use Jest or so, that is using an emulated DOM, they run pretty fast. Then you have the integration tests. Integration tests are testing the interaction between different components or parts of the system. So if you stick some together, how do they work with each other, and is the result that they bring out in combination is correct? They are still isolated from the rest of the world. So if you test 3 components that work with each other, you usually isolate away other things in the system. So you often don't have backend requests in there. stuff like that. I don't know what's your experience, but in my experience, I rarely see that in any front-end projects, or very, very few tests of these. That is because in contrast to unit tests, where it's easy to write a test and you have a fast execution, it takes longer to execute them. It needs more energy to write the test, to orchestrate these different components that work with each other. And I think that's the reason why less people doing it. And then you have the end-to-end tests. End-to-end tests, I think, are the most important and realistic tests that you can have in an application, because they are testing the real application. They are testing what the user gets, because they are testing in the browser, including the whole world behind it. So if I make a request to the backend is tested, the database is tested, even files on the file system, or you can say generally you're testing the operating system where the system under test is running on as well. Usually that makes no difference, but you're testing basically everything. If anything fails there, you get an error, and that is also what the user would get if the user is using your application. So they are the most realistic. And in the past, it was a little bit easier to write these end-to-end tests, because you always had that request to the servers, get a page back, and you just checked it, and then the next request came, and so on. And usually people use Selenium, or in many cases Selenium and Selenium Grid, which is a awesome open source solution, of course. But it was a little bit easier in the past, as I said. Nowadays, with modern dynamic web applications, it becomes much more fragile when you execute these tests, because there's an AJAX request here, an async action there, and in many Selenium tests, people have problems, and they build in some waits where they hope that a function is executed in that time before they continue with their test code. And another thing why end-to-end tests are great is because they can immensely increase your test coverage. Because if you imagine using something on the front end and clicking here and there, it goes probably to many components, through many services, to the back end, like through everything. So it covers, with every test you write, a lot of things in your system, and it's focused on the actions or the use cases of the user. So when end-to-end tests are so great in theory, why are there not more end-to-end tests? And the reason why there are not more automated end-to-end tests, because you can also end-to-end test manually, of course. It's mostly that asynchronity and external dependencies are killing the cat. So that is because you don't have control over these systems, and you don't know when an action is really ending, or when the data comes back from the back end. The setup is really hard, because in order for all this to work, you have to set up the whole system. Maybe you have to fire up some Docker images that work with each other to test it on your local machine. On the CI system, you have to ask the administrator, oh, can you please give us some virtual instances or whatever where we can run the browsers in. These have to talk to the Selenium grid. There are maybe firewalls preventing the communication between. So there's much to set up and hard to orchestrate all this. And usually things fail there. Maybe I was just unlucky in my projects, but maybe you share the pain with me. And Often also infrastructure is missing, so you cannot just get like 5 servers for running all your browsers or so. It's sometimes just not possible. Or you have a CI system where you don't have a browser installed. Very often, I guess that might be the case. Yeah, and also performance. It usually takes very long to execute end-to-end tests because many things are affected and things have to be resetted during the execution. And so it is really slow as hell. And also your developer machine, if you run it locally, is probably aching under the load because you always hear the fan running and the keyboard gets warmer and warmer, like a climate change under your fingers, right? And also it is hard for creating and maintaining the test data for a project because you have to have some reproducible data that you can rely on that behaves all the time the same. So this is also hard to do. And adding it to an existing project is also usually very hard, at least in my past, it was hard to configure that into. And the tool chain is complex to configure. Usually you have, I don't know, a Maven, an NPM, some other testing tools to run. You have to run the backend, the Selenium grid that I told you about, and so on. And that also on the CI with firewalls and whatever. There can be many problems. Of course, if you have a nice Docker setup, maybe some of the pain points you don't have, but I think you get the overall idea, and that's why I think we rarely get nice things. And here Cypress comes to the rescue. Why is it coming to the rescue? Because it brought in a modern mindset, because it focused more on the developer experience. It's not just let's test the system. Is the team that thinks about, okay, how we can make it easier for the people to do end-to-end tests. And that was a primary goal. And it delivers an easy setup, which enables the people to have a quick start very easily. It fixes the asynchronity challenges you have in your project because it has some way of dealing with asynchronity that is, or at least I haven't seen that in other systems. And the tests are more stable, at least when you follow a little bit along in the community, learn about some patterns, how to test things, you can achieve an awesome test stability. And also awesome debugging, because who doesn't know it? During the test runs, there will be problems, maybe on your machine or maybe in the CI. And then it would be nice if you can debug it. And it has convenient mocking, so because it resides in the browser itself, in the same context as your application, you can basically mock everything, and that is great. And last but not least, it has a terrific documentation, and I never have seen that in an open source available tool like it is in Cypress, because the documentation is great and explains all of the concepts very well. And whenever I had a question and I came back to the documentation, I quickly had the solution. Of course, as with everything, not for every question, but it's just a small fraction of the questions that couldn't be answered through the documentation. But then on the other hand, the team posts and blog posts and so on about how to solve things, and I always found a solution in a very reasonable time. And yeah, in my view, it was running more and more stable than other solutions, except when really something in the application is broken. I don't want to lift it up too much because, of course, also other tools are working towards having a better developer experience, but I think Cypress is there a step ahead. And yeah, why that new objective, developer experience? I really like to add that because for me it's retaining sanity in the project or in your mind, and it's staying friends with your coworkers because you can ensure that your code works, right? And you can keep talent in the company because we all know that we want to have good tested code that we can rely on, and we don't want to get frustrated. And when you frustrate developers, maybe your best developers will leave your company or leave your team. And also keeping the fun of coding, right? We all maybe, or at least I, started developing because I can create things out of nothing and quickly, and I see things working, and I don't like to get frustrated. Okay, coming to how is Cypress achieving all these things that I now promised you as developer experience. So one of the reasons is it's batteries included. So all of the setups problems it avoids that you have in other solutions, because it comes with a testing framework. It comes with an assertion library that is already set up and pre-configured for you. It has a launcher and test runner, and you don't have to figure out how to combine it with your application. We have a great reporter where we see what really happened during the test run, and have also a nice overview about the tests that had been successful, which failed, and what was a problem. Also, it brings a browser. Why it brings a browser? Because sometimes you don't have, as I said, a browser installed on the system where the tests run, like in the CI environment, or you just want to have one browser as a reference to know what's going on, and therefore you have then that Electron browser, so you don't have to ask an administrator to install a browser. It just uses its own. Of course, you can test with Chrome and the newest Edge browser and Firefox as well. Also, it brings a proxy for request stubbing. So the requests made to the server, you can manipulate and you can look what's happening in the front end. And all this is achieved without using Selenium or WebDriver. What it uses is it's using browser automation APIs, and it's taking your test spec code and injecting it into the browser window, and that enables it to have an eye on what's happening in the application, where are new nodes coming into the DOM, and can have a grip on some of the APIs. And also the setup is very easy because of these things, because it's just one command and you're ready to go. And that's not a lie. You just type npx Cypress run Cypress open now in your console if you want to. Then it will now install Cypress on your, or it will download Cypress on your system and execute it. You can install it globally if you want to, and just start testing any website you want. It doesn't need to be integrated into your project deeply, or so. You can just start. Also, it's very CI friendly because of that zero infrastructure I told you about, because you are not dependent on the administrator doing some stuff for you. And this is how a test in Cypress looks like. It's a very simple test in this case. You know probably the describe blocks. Sometimes people use context. That's an alternative syntax you can use. And the it is, of course, a test. And if you use the alternative language method, it would be test. And with that side, this is a global Cypress object that is always available. All commands are included there. And that site.visit just says, okay, go to the adesso.de website, and site.contains and looks on the whole website. Is that text somewhere in there? If you execute that now, it's probably not working anymore because our website is changing, of course, and the text is not there anymore because content changed. But this is already a full test because it looks for the text, and it implicitly also has an assertion because that has to be there, the text, otherwise the test fails. And a more complex test may look like this, or this is two tests. And in these, it will click elements, as you see with the navbar header. I used here the CSS selectors. There are other ways where you that are better and more solid in project, but people understand it more when they see it first time with CSS selectors. And you can click elements very easily. You can use .type to enter text into fields. You can also press the enter key. And with all of these things, like when I click, Cypress is checking, is that element in the view? Is it not? It scrolls to the element. If it then wants to click on it, it is checking, okay, is there another element above it that prevents that I click it? Can the user really click that element, or is something blocking it? If something is blocking it, it fails. And what you see here is also the chain of commands. This is a very crucial part of Cypress that makes it strong, because with that chain of commands that you have here, it basically synchronizes an asynchronous application, because it waits for things to appear in the DOM. And you have less reliance of time anymore, more on elements and request interceptions. Okay. Also, it has another philosophy that you can use for your projects. Checking what is important for your project. When you have, for example, a shop, and you have probably many back-end systems you talk to get together all the data that you see. The question is all of this even important when you run your tests? Because maybe stuff like the tracking and some partner APIs you don't care about. The only thing you care about is that people can buy stuff in your shop. So you can focus more on relevant requests for your use cases than on testing everything on the site to work and prevent the fails. So you can mock away the tracking and the partner APIs to just be sure that the core functionality of your application is working. This, of course, has some downsides, as some might ask themselves now, but we can talk about that later. So another advantage of request mocking is you don't have to wait for the backend, because we can mock it until they are ready with their backend, and we can still prepare our tests. And tests is if our part in the front end is working correctly. And in versions lower, version 6 of Cypress, you only had site.server and site.route. I don't go into that right now because this is the old thingy, and the new weapon in Cypress is site.intercept. I show you on the next slide why Intercept is so different, but they streamlined the API a little bit more to make it easier to use. Of course, request mocking, as I say, doesn't integrate then with the backend, because everything you mock away, you're not testing end to end, right? So it's also a good idea if the backend has tests for the API, or you maybe want to do contract testing or different other measurements to test the APIs you're talking to. You can then consider having a full end-to-end test at nighttime. So during the day, you maybe just do a front-end integration tests during your merge requests, where you don't rely on some of the backends, or maybe on nothing from the backend. You can just make a front-end integration test. And then at nighttime, you have that long running, I don't know, 3 hours test that is really testing everything. And you could even think about reusing stuff, reusing code that you wrote, because you just take away the mocking, maybe. But of course, you have to manage your test data then. And what you get by that, if you just make a front-end integration test for a front-end dev, is, of course, fast feedback cycles. And these are very, very crucial, I think, because in many projects, people just commit something to the master, and at night it executes the end-to-end tests, and then they fail. And it's very frustrating when you come at the next morning and see, okay, all the other tests also didn't run because some tests at the beginning somehow failed. And with the front-end integration testing, you circumvent that problem a little bit. So what's the difference between sci.request and sci.intercept? Previously, I told you already, Cypress is injecting the test code into the window instance, so it lives beside your application code. And also the mocking was before, the backend mocking was implemented in the front end. And there had been some functions like fetch that had not been mocked by it. Also, if you load over an image tag or a video tag some code, so some content from the server, that could not be intercepted, because that is loaded by the browser then, and not by JavaScript code. So it had no way to intercept it. And now we have that intercept, and intercept is a real proxy outside of the browser window context, like you maybe have thought of it before. And it's the same, it's integrated into Cypress the same. You just have your test code, and inside of your test code you can configure and steer or control your proxy. So now you can even test everything, like image, video, or whatever you have, and that can be pretty useful. For example, in an actual application I am in, you can intercept the call of the loading of a PDF file and maybe inject your own. So I think this is really great and works to improve your tests. Also, continuous integration. I told you several times already, you have zero infrastructure. That gives you a headless start into testing. And npm start and Cypress run that you execute on the console. And I added here that fails normally because your application sometimes needs to start up first, right? Because I don't know, maybe it's Angular and it compiles a minute or two, and if it hits the timeout, Cypress run will not wait anymore. There's a package for that. It's start server and run that enables that, and I would strongly suggest you to use that. And to speed things up, you can also use a parallel flag that works when you use Cypress IO dashboard, and it even has more features like some statistics over flaggy tests and so on. Also, it drops out videos for debugging if it fails. So if you have a fail in the CI system, you maybe know it. You think, okay, it worked on my machine, why it fails in the CI? And then it recorded a screen recording for you that you can make available through your CI system. Most of the systems allow you to place some artifacts somewhere, and later you can download them to analyze what went wrong. This is really helpful, in my opinion. And also, debugging tests. You can debug the hell out of your tests because you can use the normal dev tools. You can open the dev tools while Cypress is running, and you can also force to open the dev tools with the .debug command, and you get really rich debug output. That even includes tables, like when someone typed something, you have a nice overview of what really happened. Also requests, you can see, okay, what request went out, what response came back, when did it came back, and you can go back through the steps that Cypress did to travel back in time to see what was the state of the application at that time, or at least the state of the DOM. And reporting. Also with Cypress, some tests will break. If it breaks, I want to know what happened. Then I have that recorded video. I can always start the recording also on my local machine. And you can, I already said that before, so skip that. And you will get also a full code coverage of your code, because I told you at the beginning, I'm including much of the code when I use functions in the front end, because it goes through all these services and so on. And it can be really nice to collect that code coverage as well, so that you know, okay, how much code is covered by my end-to-end tests, and also with my unit tests. In one of our projects, we even combine it because it was a project where no tests had been there, and we overtook it from someone else, and we used that to have a little bit safer feeling to not breaking anything when we develop new features, and we slowly are able to build up more testing in the application. Okay, so how does it look like? This is Cypress when it's executing a test, and when you see then that picture is changing with a black border. I don't know if in this state, here a screenshot happened. What that means, we can later look at. And also you see, okay, here was something that broke in the test, and I can click on all of these things here on the left to see the state. So that is another great feature, taking screenshots easily. With Screenshot, I can screenshot the whole page and make a snapshot. And if I select a single element with Cyget, you have a selector on that out page object, and I say make a screenshot with that file name, and that part of the page is then saved as a screenshot. And I think that is great because you can also provide these screenshots then after the test run to designers. Maybe they want to check if the new release of your software is still intact in some of the things. Or you can do visual regression tests, and you can plug in like any image comparison software. There are some commercial services that already provide some Cypress plugins, and they partner with Cypress that you can just use, but there are also on NPM open source solutions that you can use and integrate. And writing a command to use whatever image comparison you want to use is fairly easy or doable. And I promised you something additionally at the beginning, and it's automation of user documentation. Where I think with that, it's possible to lift the screenshot compatibility to a new level. And the problem with user documentation nowadays is that it is crucial in many contexts. Like if you have an enterprise project, you much likely have users that demand a handbook or they need an online help. And with this help, you also require some screenshots for the users to understand the feature and how to use it. But keeping that in sync is very hard because what changed again in the release? Where we made changes? Can you remember in your last software release what had been the things you all changed? And finding and updated the affected screenshot by that change can also be hard because maybe, yeah, I changed this component. Oh, where is that used? In how many contexts? And that can really help you. And while skipping some of the updates, because they don't hit the core functionality of your application, it's still frustrating that they are not updated, right? And you also don't know if the system is still working as you described in your own documentation. And then I get into thinking and had an idea during a customer project and where we had exactly problems with online documentation and updating those screenshots. And then I wrote to Gleb from the Cypress team. Awesome guy, by the way. You should check his blog if you're doing anything with Cypress. He gets you covered. And I wrote him and explained my idea. That was the following. I could write a Cypress test for every section or chapter in my documentation. Why should I do that? It is possible to make screenshots so easily as I've shown you before. And with that, I then can update with the screenshots with every release. When I, for one section in the documentation, write a test, I can make the screenshots that I need to update them. And I would even be sure that the application still behaves like it's described in my documentation because I have a test for that. And that could also be great to find outdated documentation or where maybe your application broke with something that you promised the user in the documentation. And either we have to fix the app and have a different test, or we can adjust the documentation because the failing section could mean, okay, now the user experience is different there. You have to click different things. And I think this could be the first step into a new era of documentation. And I argued that it would be also very simple due to the extendable architecture of Cypress to embed the tests in the actual documentation. Okay, how could I do that? I mean, if I use Markdown for documentation purposes or for my handbook, I could maybe adapt it and put it into the Markdown text itself, then it maybe could look like this. And here I use a screenshot of the to-dos, and the test there is just preparing the site to the state I want to have, and I say screenshot, and that's end. That is what you have in that fiddle adding to-do section, where I have my test code for the thing that I described before. Of course, here's not much text in there now, but this would also be possible to adapt to different syntaxes. If you maybe use ASCII doc, if you use any XML or whatever, basically you could add those tests to whatever allows you to embed something or where you can pass it out. And with some JavaScript, you can just extract the tests from there and execute them. And maybe you can also combine it with Cucumber to have even more readable text that maybe makes sense for some other stakeholders as well, and run it as test code. And I had proposed this idea to Gleb and went to sleep because it was really late. But Gleb seems to be a night person. And the next morning, when I woke up, I had this. And he really implemented it overnight. And as I said, Cypress is pretty extendable. It is not too hard to implement it when you know how the architecture is. And what he then presented to me is a little to-do app with a handbook already running, coming out of a Markdown, and building these beautiful docs. So the docs are based on, what was the name? ViewPress, I think, to have this nice interface. And it already had been there, and they are taking care of transforming the Markdown to the website. And while the test is running, the screenshots are updated. And this could also be great if you have a white label solution where you have tenant-specific documentation and screenshots. So every tenant can have their design in their online documentation or handbook. And isn't that great? I mean, you could also think about maybe having specific features that are only available to some customers that are not visible in the documentation then. And yeah, that was my idea that I had. And there is an implementation. There's, of course, still much to do to improve that or make it into a full tool to make the full roundup. But I think it's a start. Yes, so far, thanks for listening. And if you're somehow looking for a challenge, we are always looking for nice people joining our company. You can just contact me or can contact one of our two hosts. I think they will help you. And before I would enter the Q&A, I have one more thing maybe that I want to say, because shortcomings and limitations. I have with Cypress only the Chromium engines and Firefox. So if you have to test EE11, it will not work with Cypress and probably will never be. There is a pull request for that, but that will never find its way in the core, I think. And as EE11 is dying anyway, maybe it's not relevant anymore. And also Safari, you cannot test right now. They had some talks with the Safari team, but I think for some time you don't have to dream about it. And the test code is JavaScript only. Why is that a downside? Because first it's scoped to the browser. So you can only test web applications. Maybe that's a problem. Also, maybe your the other developers in the project are Java developers, and now they have to use JavaScript to write the tests. Maybe they don't like it. But if you add TypeScript, and that is just a simple compiler step to the project, maybe that ease their pain. And you can only test one origin, so one host. That can be a problem for you, or many people stumble when you have to log in over an OAuth website or single sign-on site somewhere. But there are, of course, ways and plugins how to do it, or making the authentication and then mocking it into the application, or injecting the authentication into the application. But it's important to know. And you only have one browser, one tab, and no target blank tests. So if you want to test if something is opening in a new browser window or a new tab, that's not possible right now. There are ways, of course, to handle that. I usually make it that I mock the window open and check if that is happening, but prevents the real opening, or I redirect it to the current browser tab. Also, file uploading, upload testing is a little bit hacky because they haven't found yet one solution that will please anybody. There are just some complications in there. You can implement it. It's not very complicated, but you still have to do a little bit on your own. Yeah. And
all right, great, great talk, Tobias. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll. It's not before we go to the questions. Maybe highlight the comments from Nick Dislin. That's complimenting you on the automated documentation being a fantastic idea, and similar from Tristan Lucas. Cypress as Markdown content creator for SSG Jamstacked documentation websites. That's a great idea. So kudos for that. The other questions from the comments I've added to the list that you're displaying, so we can
Great.
through there.
I'm using here that tool from Slido. It's also a nice tool, and you can use it for free for some question, for some polls and so on. So I would really recommend it as well. So wait, no, I don't. I should not press the wrong button. This one. Okay. So what are your thoughts on managing and documenting test data usage in Laser test suites using Cypress? I'm not quite sure what is meant by it. I mean, the test data you have to manage anyway. You just use Cypress with some commands to maybe load it. Maybe you can use a Q&A tool and improve a little bit on that, or we can later do it in our get-together session. Okay, the next is how to handle reusability and maintainability within Cypress. Also a question. I'm quite concerned what you mean with reusability, but here's my take. What we often have is like we want to log in at the beginning when we have a test. And to make that login, we usually write commands. A login command that I can fire up in a before each, or before each block I can use, like you maybe know it from other testing libraries, or I can have it in my test as well. Some of the functionality that I need very often, like I have a standard way of how my tables look, and I want to look in what column and row is a specific kind of data, we usually write commands. And with those commands, we can reuse them across tests and don't have to write bigger blocks of test code. I hope that answers your question. Otherwise, add another more detailed one. What are your thoughts on managing and document? I had that before, sorry. So from the comments came also security and Cypress. Is there any flexible go around without stubbing for every test? What security you want to test? I don't know. David or Iris, you have an idea what that could mean?
Not exactly, but that was a question by Midasi Bayram. Maybe he's still around to...
Okay, maybe add another comment.
Yeah.
Is there any best way to use some wait time instead of wait? Yes. What you don't want to do in Cypress is using the wait command. Period. No, of course there's more. What you did in tools like Selenium or so is maybe having a wait with a specific amount of time, like 500 milliseconds, 1,000, 4,000, I don't know. And many waits you don't have to do with Cypress because of that chain of commands. I can show you a little bit of that because I have prepared a slide for that. This is a chain of commands in a little bit more detail. Every time you use that sci.get command, it starts a new chain. And in that chain, you then have an assertion. And what Cypress is then doing, it is executing that command and tries to find the selector. And maybe it's not on that page yet. And it's retrying and retrying all the time to execute that command and runs the assertion until this is successful. And if it's successful, it runs the next command in the chain and makes the next comparison. And in that, you already have some waits. Like the default waiting time is 4 seconds. It waits up to 4 seconds in any of these steps. And if that timeout is done, then it would also, of course, fail. But what you can do with any of these commands that I showed you, you can add a specific timeout. So there you can add with curly braces timeout, and for example, 30,000 milliseconds. And maybe you now think, okay, what's the difference to other solutions like maybe Selenium? Cypress is still waiting for the command to fulfill. As soon as the command is fulfilled, it continues with testing. So basically, you can put in there any amount of timeout that you want, but your test doesn't have to wait for all that time, for a fixed time. It just has to wait until the element appears. Or what you also often do is waiting for specific requests to happen. Because if you load a client list and then click on details, that click on details is probably firing another request. And you can intercept that, and you don't have to mock it. But with the intercept, you can still look into it, and with the .s, you can even alias it. And at one point, then you can say wait, but not a specific time, but give the alias of that request. And then Cypress just waits until that request happened. And after it happened, it continues executing the other commands that come in after it. But as soon as you use sci.weight and a number, you probably given up. You're messing up a little bit. You don't want to wait a specific time. You want, as I said, wait for elements or requests. I hope that answers the question. Where can we? Yeah.
The security question from before was about OAuth and token, but we've already answered the question. So
yeah, there are, as I said, plugins that you can try. You can try using NTLM for your local network, maybe, or OAuth plugins. Yeah. Okay, from David. So it's also from the commands. Where can we look to find out more about these patterns that improve test stability? First of all, I would say joining meetups. There are some great meetup groups like the London meetup group, the Cypress DE community, and there's also Dutch community. I was there recently, and I can suggest you go there. There will be nice talks. And in these talks, there are many of these patterns explained. There are also many videos on YouTube about flaky tests with Cypress. Maybe I can later find out some of the links and post them into the meetup group, so that I'm not sure how fast I will be, but tomorrow or on the weekend I will edit there, and there are some nice videos that probably will help you. Is there a way to skip conditional it blocks if the previous it block getting failed? No, it is not, because all of these tests should not, in my opinion, depend on each other. Some people do it like that. They let it depend on each other, but the problem you have is it's getting harder to predict what's happening, and when you, for example, execute stuff in parallel, it could also influence each other. So I don't know of any way to block that, and I would not suggest it. Maybe if you explain later in our get-together a little bit more why you want to do it, maybe I have an alternative solution for you. Or yeah, maybe we find out there. What are the names of some of image comparison tools that work with Cypress? There is a plugin list, and they also have their partners somewhere listed. It's somewhere on the page. I don't have it on my mind right now, but it's definitely on the page. And if you look in the plugins, you will find some. Maybe one more thing about visual regression testing. There are some cobblestones, some hurdles to take, and that is where will you create the snapshots that you compare the image with. I mean, you have a snapshot that is the truth that you want to have in the system, and on later test runs you compare what's coming out with that image. And one of the problems you have in these contexts is that depending on the operating system you're on, those images will differ. Maybe they will differ even much. Not that your eye will see it, but a computer will see it, because there are slightly differences in colors depending if you're on Linux or Windows or Mac OS. Or there is another algorithm that is calculating a shadow of a box or whatever, and you can set some thresholds, but some thresholds are also too big. And one important thing is always execute the comparison and also the generation of the first image on the same type of system. It should be on the same. So it's sometimes hard to execute it on a developer machine, and on the CI system it will fail because as a developer you in many cases have Mac OS or Windows, and on the CI system you usually have Linux. And one of the ideas is then to store it away in an S3 bucket or whatever, from a Linux system or from the CI system, and then do the comparisons, and don't do it on the developer machine. But also there, in the near future, I think there's a recording of Angular Vienna meetup about visual regression testing. And also we in the Cypress DE community will very soon have a visual regression session or a visual regression talk. And yeah, maybe you can come and join us. I will put the link into the meetup as well, if David is fine with that. David and Iris, sorry. Okay, will it affect page object slowness of Cypress? Will it affect page object slowness of Cypress? I don't. Do you mean if using of page object is making Cypress tests slower, or maybe you can comment on that? Okay, while we wait for the answer, I will first continue with this one. Recommendations for testing pages that take a long time to load. I had where I had to wait for the DOM to load to make sure elements are fully loaded. Yeah, what I said, you visit an URL and you can first wait for the URL to load, and also for an element you're waiting for. And with every Cypress command, you can add in the when waiting for I don't know, a headline, for example. You just make a comma and curly braces for an object and say timeout, and you can set that timeout to whatever you want. Even if it's 5 minutes, it's okay. Of course, you don't want your test to execute so slowly, but if you have no other option and the page that just needs that time, you can wait that time. And the advantage is only with Cypress, as soon as that element appears in the DOM, the test continues to run. So if it's normally 5 minutes and then you fix your problem where your page is so slow and it's finished in 10 seconds, it only waits 10 seconds because then the element is there. Will it? That's
yeah, we had
again.
Yeah,
It was the speed. No, you can if you want, you can use a page object. There had been some controversies because the Cypress teams favors more like an action pattern instead of the page object, because they say, okay, with the page object, basically you have the risk to add another application over your application and even have state in there. I don't have a big problem with that. It really depends on how you use it. If you just use it as a container to organize how you access the page, I think that's okay. On the other hand, my tests are usually very small. Even when they're testing many features, it's, I don't know, 30 up to 50 lines of code, and then most of the tests are already done. And maybe if you have a page object and do so much, maybe you can, or you have very specific selectors. And one suggestion I always give is, don't look or don't depend too much on the DOM, depend on what the user is seeing. So sometimes you need to depend like on a module or so. But generally you can use sci.contains much to look for text on the page. If I have, for example, a shopping cart and I click the buy button, I don't care where on the page that buy button is normally. I just look for a button that contains the text "Buy now," and I click that wherever that button is, and that usually helps because you don't have 20 buy now buttons on the page that do different things. That is just a simple example, but that is how I usually process stuff. Or also, if I have a master detail view and I click in the master on one entry and the detail appears, I just have to look, okay, is the title I'm expecting now on the page or not? Then that is in many cases already enough. And if I need to know if it's in that section, maybe I can really use one selector to select that, or it's also a good pattern to use that role attribute. That is also good for accessibility, because when you give the things roles on the page, you can select by role, and there's also a collection of nice commands from the people of the testing library. You can just install them with Cypress, and then you can just say find by role, and you just add that role, and then under that you can say contains, and you know, okay, in that section it is in. So maybe you more want to rely on these things.
All right.
But the last question is, what do you believe to be the best approach for documenting test data being utilized in test scenarios? Documenting. I don't know, actually. I don't document that much. If you have test cases, I mean, it's laying beside the test cases in many situations, I think, and because of the usage in the test cases. But I haven't thought much about that. I didn't have much problems until now. But maybe I make some new experiences, and maybe then I have to think of it.
All
okay.
Right. Great. With that, for the people that are still around, thank you for joining us. And we've also set up I'll put it here, a chat room where you can join. Just click the link, add your name, and you can enter if you like to hang out with us and chat person to person with. I'll be joining, I think Tobias as well, Iris,
yes.
I believe as well. So yeah, thanks for joining. And we'll see you in a minute on Whereby. And also, as Tobias has mentioned, he'll add the more details to the event page on Meetup. Yeah, thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, talk was amazing. Thanks for being here. And we'll see you all next time.
Yes, thank you.
Great.